Je ne suis pas bilingue du tout. Thank you very much, Frederic, for that charming and very touching introduction. So I have a very strong sense of humility standing here in front of you, and I am very sensible of the honor, the great honor of being awarded the Jean Jaurès Prize. When I look at the people who have had this prize before, I have felt a real sense of trepidation. So all I can do is my best, and I'd like to thank the CNRS and the Fondation Meyer for the generosity of this prize and for the possibility to give this series of 4 lectures on the general title of Volition, Agency and Responsibility. And today's lecture is going to be about volition because we're going to start at the beginning. So I'm going to speak for about an hour on the topic of volition, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. What is volition? Well, it's always a good idea to start with a dictionary definition. So the Oxford English Dictionary refers to volition as the faculty or power of using one's will. There are some interesting etymological points because volition doesn't really translate well into many other languages, including French. So let's just hope that we can use the dictionary definitions given in English. But from the point of view of my talk, really, I want to take a more cognitive and process-based interpretation of volition. And I'm going to be talking about the processes that underlie the motivation, the choice, and the initiation of one's own actions. So I'm going to be talking about the genesis of individual human action. I'd like to begin by reading you a quote from this excellent book by Ian McEwan called Atonement, which really means I can go home because most of what's worth saying about volition is said in this passage from Ian McEwan. He is describing the experience of a young adolescent who is sitting on a hot summer's afternoon and thinking in the way that adolescents do. She raised one hand and she flexed its fingers, and she wondered how this thing, this machine for gripping, this fleshy little spider on the end of her arm, came to be hers and entirely at her command. Or did her hand have some little life of its own? She bent her finger and she straightened it. The mystery was in the instant before the finger moved, the dividing line between not moving and moving when her intention took effect. It was like a wave breaking, and if only she could find herself at the crest of the wave, she thought she might find the secret part of herself that was really in charge. She brought her finger close to her face, and she stared at it, urging it to move. But the finger remained still because she was pretending. She wasn't entirely serious, and because willing the finger to move, or being about to move it, was not the same as actually moving it. And when she did move the finger finally, the action seemed to start in the finger itself and not in some part of her mind. When did the finger know to move? When did she know to move the finger? There was no way to catch herself out. Brilliant description of the question of where do our actions come from and who is in charge of them. And I am sure that Ian McEwan had in fact read most of the neuroscientific literature, which I'm going to be referring to in my talk today. So, as I say, the lecture is in a way already prefigured. But let's just look at that experience of volition as described by McEwan, in which I think we can recognize ourselves in some of our everyday life experiences of voluntary action. And let's see what's characteristic about it. The first thing is that there's an objective certainty about action itself. There's a physical movement of the body, there's a contraction of the muscle, that's a fact, that's undeniable. And that is, if you like, the end point of volition, is the physical movement of the body in action. There's an elusive phenomenology, there's this strange feeling, sometimes vivid, sometimes almost disappearing, of where is the action controlled and commanded. We'll talk a bit about phenomenology later in the talk. And finally, there's a very strong importance some of our voluntary actions are really, really important, mainly because they affect other people. And in this beautiful book by Ian McEwan, the whole book, in fact, turns on a moment where this character, this young girl, tells a lie. She's not moving her finger for the really important action in the book, she's moving her vocal cords, but she tells a lie, and it unleashes a wave of destruction which affects everybody around her and lots of lives. So that's quite common, and it's something that we know from our own experience. So our voluntary actions are extremely important. What I'm going to try and do in the next hour or so is to just try and say three things. I'm going to introduce the concept of internally generated action, which is a rather interesting definition which has been used in cognitive neuroscience as being an accessible, empirically tractable way of talking about volition. I'm going to talk about the subjective experience of volition, and I'm going to end with some much more recent work in which we introduce the idea of there being an internal volitional signal, and we ask, is it true, does it exist, can we find it, and what does it mean? So internally generated action. What do we mean by internally generated action? Well, let's start with this beautiful quote by Wittgenstein. What is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? A well-known conundrum, a well-known question. Now, I think Wittgenstein probably wouldn't have approved of the answer that I'm going to try to give, and he probably meant the question in a fairly ironic sense. But let's see if we can take his question at face value. And the way that I want to try and do that is to introduce the concept of reverse engineering. Reverse engineering. So a reverse engineering activity in software, for example, consists of taking or stealing a piece of proprietary software and trying to find the underlying code that makes it work. We're not going to do that. We're going to reverse engineer actions. We're going to say the arm moves. Why does the arm move? Can we trace the causal chain backwards, and can that shed any light on the fact that I raise my arm? Well, in cognitive neuroscience, what we would first of all do is start with the movement itself. So movements always involve the contractions of muscles. This is a rather relevant figure because this person is indeed raising their right arm by contracting their biceps muscle. How are they doing that? Well, the muscles on the right-hand side of the body are controlled by the primary motor cortex in the left hemisphere. So we immediately have what neurophysiologists think of as the source of the final motor command which causes the movement. So these motor commands are neural impulses which leave the brain, go down the spinal cord, synapse onto the motor neurons, and cause muscles to contract. But then, of course, we need to reverse engineer back from that. Why is there a neural activity in the motor cortex? And this is where it begins to get interesting, because immediately in front of the primary motor cortex, the primary cortex is shown here in pink, and immediately in front of that is an area called Brodmann's Area 6. Premotor cortex. Now, Brodmann's Area 6 is interesting because it's a homogeneous area, but it seems to have two completely separate functional parts. So in the lateral part of Area 6, which I've shown here as this blue arrow, there are neurons which project back to the primary motor cortex and thus can make those neurons fire, which can make muscles contract, which can make arms go up, but which are concerned with externally triggered movements. So the lateral part of this brain area is concerned with things like catching a ball or punching somebody in the face or movements towards a target, very often spatial orientation and sensorily guided movements. And in contrast, the medial part of Area 6, which is often called the supplementary motor area, right up here on the top of the brain and going right over the convexity down into the interhemispheric fissure, the medial part of Area 6 seems also to send instructions back to the primary motor cortex to move the arm, but for a quite different reason, for so-called internally generated actions. And this idea of there being two routes to action corresponding to these two subdivisions of Brodmann's Area 6 is associated with the seminal work of Dick Passickham back in the 70s and 80s. Now, what can we understand by internally generated action? It's quite a philosophically tricky concept. What is the generation here? And in the work in cognitive neuroscience, people often think about either a dimension extending from externally triggered actions, which are caused by a stimulus, through to internally generated actions, which are not. Sometimes they think about this more as a dichotomy rather than a dimension. That's just a kind of a intellectual tool which doesn't really matter. The most important thing is that we know what an externally triggered action is. We know what it is to catch a ball. We know that, in a sense, these are reflexes, where all the information that's present in the movement, in the action, is in a sense already present in the stimulus. So a reflex, by definition, there's not much more to the action than there is to the stimulus that causes it. And we know that you can have a reflex with even a fairly simple kind of nervous system. So even an animal like this worm can make a very good coordinated reflex movement away from some irritant which touches it on the skin. But it's much harder to say what's at this end of the dimension. And there's a great tendency in cognitive neuroscience to define internally generated actions by exclusion. They're actions which are not caused by stimuli. We don't say what they are caused by, we say they're not caused by a stimulus. So they're non-reflexes. And that's a quite interesting conceptual problem, and you might have your own views about whether that's adequate, but it leads to concepts, or it's associated with concepts like free will, which I'm going to try always to use in scare quotes because I'm not quite sure it's the right term, and it leads to the idea that animals like this have an extremely sort of sophisticated, rational, flexible, even intelligent way of controlling their movement, which is really going beyond the kind of stimulus-triggered movements that other animals have. And you can see a lot of heritage in biological science running through Descartes and running through many other thinkers, which draws this interesting comparison between stereotype mechanical reflexes and intelligent rational action. And that, in a sense, is what internally generated action is. And it's the backdrop, the scientific backdrop on which we want to talk about volition. So if we translate that conceptual dimension between externally triggered and internally generated actions into processes, into events which happen in the brain, in time, in causal relations, and implemented by neurons, by chemistry and by electricity, what can we say? Well, we have no problem with thinking that an externally triggered action is a bit like a reflex because the stimulus just causes the response. And then when we think about internally generated actions, we tend to find rather more abstract, rather stranger terminology. So we can think about the movements of internally generated action as being somehow exceptional. They seem to come from nowhere. They're a bit like a deus ex machina, or they're caused by the self, I, in scare quotes, or they're caused by consciousness. And there's something sort of unsatisfactory about all of these concepts of internally generated action. They're all what I would call exceptionalists. They all seem to escape from what we normally think of as the causal origins of our movements. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to an alternative way of conceptualizing internal generation, which is internally generated movements do not come from nothing, as is the conventional sort of exceptionalist view. Instead, they seem to come from everything. So perhaps the right way to think about a volitional action, an internally generated action, is it somehow involves some kind of cognitive combination of everything that is relevant, as opposed to a single stimulus. So if I throw a ball at somebody and they reach out and catch the ball, or they duck away from the ball to avoid it, that stimulus is the sole individuated cause of their action, in a sense, whereas our volitional actions may just be based on the integration of a much larger number of causes and a much more sophisticated integrative process. So that's quite interesting. That's an alternative theory of what internally generated action is, but it's still pretty unsatisfactory. There are two reasons why it's unsatisfactory. One is it becomes very difficult to distinguish volitional cognition from lots of other terms in cognitive sciences, and people would end up saying, oh, so what you mean by volition is really just intelligence, or it's really just rationality, or it's really just reward-based decision-making. So there's this sense that actually all psychologists are really talking about the same thing. And they say, well, I work on decision-making, and others will say I work on intelligence. But maybe all that they really mean is the ability to make the right action based on integrating lots of possible information. Now, that argument's a little bit hard to resist, I think, but I'd just like to make two pleas to plead for the concept of voluntary action. So the first one is that it's really important to remember that voluntary action is focusing on the movement. It's aiming at producing objective physical events in the outside world, which are the movements of arms, the movements of fingers on triggers or on buttons. These are actions which are actually going through the primary motor cortex and translating thoughts into physical events. And that's not something that we really think about at all in some of these other fields of psychology. The second point is that the actions that we think about in the context of volition become really important because they can, as it were, change the world. So the reason why volitional action is interesting is because of the effects that it can have on our environment and on other people in particular. So that whole topic of how volitional action changes the world is the concept of sense of agency. I'm not going to talk about it at all today, but it's the theme of the next two lectures in case anybody wants to turn up. Now let's see if we can say a little bit more about this idea of internally generated action. And instead of talking about everything being the cause of an internally generated action, let's see if we can say something a little bit more specific. Well, I think the kinds of informations that become integrated when we perform actions which are not directly triggered by an external stimulus are not magic. One can think about them. They're the general context in which I feel I find myself, what psychologists often call the task. Memory, the action that I make now, is often driven by my memory of an action that I previously made, perhaps in a similar context on a previous occasion, and which worked quite well. The concept of needs has been largely forgotten in modern psychology, but Maslow proposed a hierarchy of needs, starting with things like thirst and hunger and going up to things like spiritual fulfillment. Well, we don't know quite how up that hierarchy we want to go, but a central concept of homeostatic control, of needs regulation, seems to me quite relevant to explaining why our cognitive system instructs particular movements in the absence of a stimulus. And then finally, sometimes it's just a good idea to try something out. So exploration, creativity, spontaneity are very important features, not just of humans, but of other animals too. And they're clearly an element of what we mean by by volition. Right, so there we've got this idea that volition is not exceptional. It's just a description of non-stimulus-driven action. What is there that's worth noting philosophically about these classes of action? Well, I think there are a few things which are important. All of these causes or putative causes of volitional action are all biologically comprehensible. None of them are sort of transcendental. They're all things that we can understand mechanistically. But perhaps the most important point here is the second one here on this green list. All of these things which make me perform an action not in response to an immediate stimulus, they're all things that you can't see. They're all socially opaque. All of these sources of my volitional action are covert. You don't know what context I think I'm in. You don't know what I remember doing from before. You don't know whether I'm currently hungry, thirsty, or looking for spiritual fulfillment. And you don't know whether I'm just here because I'm trying to explore by trying things that are new. We don't have much insight into the causes of other people's volitional actions. And I think a really important point is that other people are unpredictable. And because they're unpredictable, we need to have some understanding, both for others and for ourselves, of this idea that some actions are not stimulus triggered, but are coming internally. So perhaps, if you like, the social problem to which volition is the answer is this idea that everybody's actions are driven by this internal set of generators. So that's a bit of what I think we need to say about volitional action in order to make it empirically tractable. I'm now going to talk about something which is probably not empirically tractable at all, which is the whole question about why do we have any experience of volition. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes or so about phenomenology. And this has always been perhaps the focal interest. It's always been the reason why people have been interested in philosophy, in voluntary action, because people have been interested in voluntary action in philosophy because we appear to have some direct experience of some phenomenology associated with this particular kind of action. Now, I really have done all the work that I want to talk about today, and all the work that I've done on subjective experience goes back to a very, very old tradition in psychology, which is the tradition of mental chronometry. And I'd just like to pause, perhaps particularly for people who aren't psychologists, to describe a little bit about what this tradition is, because it's methodologically rather interesting. And it started with the observation of Hermann von Helmholtz early in the 19th century, that neural processes or brain processes took measurable time. So he was the first person to realize that whatever our brains did, it didn't work instantaneously. He didn't understand much about the brain. This is before Cajal. He didn't really know what a neuron was or what a neuron did, and he didn't understand that interactions between neurons were important in the way that we understand it now. He worked primarily on visual perception. His background was in physics, but he realized that acquiring a visual percept of a stimulus doesn't happen as soon as the stimulus appears. It takes time, it takes measurable time, and the amount of time it takes is potentially informative about how the perception is established. So that's a really key insight, that asking questions about when experiences occur can tell us something about the processes that generate experience. Helmholtz's insight was taken up by Wilhelm Wundt, who in many ways is the grandfather of modern experimental psychology. He established the first scientific psychological laboratory, as it's thought, in Leipzig at the end of the 19th century. And he developed a whole series of methodological tools for asking about the timing of subjective experiences, for mental chronometry. Now, the important thing about all of these mental chronometric methods is that you're only asking people when they experience things. You don't ask them what they experience. You don't ask them to elaborate or describe their percept in much detail. You just ask them about when it occurred. And famously for volition, this work was taken up by Benjamin Libet, who died relatively recently. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his work now. From the methodological point of view, Libet really just took the methods of Wundt. It's quite interesting. There's, in a way, not much more psychology in Libet than there is in Wundt, but Wundt thought that you couldn't study volition experimentally. He thought it was beyond the tractable range that his methods could reach. Other people disagreed, but Wundt didn't try. So let's talk a little bit about Libet. Now, the Libet experiment is well known, so I'm going to talk about it very quickly. It's an attempt to use mental chronometry to identify the basis of the experience of voluntary control. The feeling that we all have every day that I decide to lift my arm and bang, up goes my arm. Everyday experience, which is the sort of background of our mental lives, that we're in charge of what we're doing. Can we actually study that experience scientifically? And it's worth pointing out that Libet actually did the experiments long before he published them. This is anecdote. I haven't actually been able to prove this. It would be quite interesting to see if there's a Libet archive and whether this can be proven. But I was told by somebody who knew Libet that Libet did these experiments way back towards the end of the 60s, early 1970s, and he deliberately didn't publish them until he had tenure, because he knew there was no way that he would get tenure if he attempted to publish experiments saying that he had measured, quote, free will, unquote. So he knew that this would be a very controversial experiment, and he was absolutely right, because in philosophy there's now a sort of a mini industry of people working not really on volition, but working on the Libet experiment, as if that was some kind of separate scientific topic. But let's just describe the experiment, and you can make up your mind about it as you wish. So there are two parts to the experiment. The first part is the chronometer, the clock. And it's a funny clock because it's very, very small. It's got one hand, and the hand goes round every 2,560 milliseconds. And in a way, the clock is not actually part of the experiment at all. The clock's just there, like a ruler, like a method for you to report your experience or to measure your experience. The second part of the Libet experiment is more important for volition, and it's a rather strange idea that the person is asked to make a voluntary movement at a time of their own choosing, whenever you want to. Press this button. In our versions of the experiment, you press a button. In Libet's original experiment, it was a slightly different movement, but I don't think that's important. So this is a strange instruction, because we're not telling you when to press the button. We're leaving it up to you when you press the button. And quite often, when you say to a participant in this experiment, okay, please press the button whenever you feel like it, the participants will say, do you mean now? That, they want an instruction, but the idea is that there is no instruction. There is no single stimulus saying press the button. So we can sort of animate that in PowerPoint, because after a while the person will, as Libet put it, feel the urge to move. That's a quote from the Libet paper, that you press the button when you feel the urge to move. We'll come back to that word. Here's the person having an urge. You'll notice they press the button. The clock continues to rotate for a little bit of time. It stops in a random location, and Libet then asked his participants, where was the clock hand when you first felt the urge to move? What time on the clock did you have the experience of what I would call conscious intention? I try to avoid the urge word. Okay. So in this particular example, perhaps the person says, well, I think I felt the urge to move when the clock hand was at 23. They actually pressed the button when the clock hand was at 25. We know how fast the clock hand is going, so we can say, how long before they actually moved did they experience the conscious intention to move? How long before movement did they have conscious will? And while this is happening, Libet was recording brain activity using non-invasive scalp electrodes. Here they're embedded into a funny hat, but that's not important. The point is that when there is activity in the brain, in the superficial areas of the cortex, you can record tiny, tiny voltages non-invasively from the scalp above. And in particular, over these kinds of electrodes here, over the frontal motor areas of the brain, you can record an electrical signal called the readiness potential. I'm going to come on to talk in more detail about that later, but let's just take it as Libet took it. The readiness potential is an EEG signal which precedes voluntary action. And for technical reasons, which I think I don't myself understand, but may be deeply, deeply profound, when there's activity in the brain, the voltage that you measure at the scalp tends to be negative. So we always plot EEG negative up, right? And that just tends to correspond to this reality that brain activity produces increases in negativity. So we always plot negative up. Here's the voltage in millionths of a volt recorded over the frontal areas of the brain with negative up and positive down as a function of time. And 0 is the moment where the person actually presses the button. And the readiness potential refers to this gradual ramp-like increase in negative voltage, which appears to build up and up and up and up, and then trigger into a descent at the moment when the person actually presses the button. And the result from the Libet experiment is very simple. It's simply that the average time of the W judgment, or judgment of will, as Libet called it, this experience that now I feel the urge to press the button, is 206 milliseconds before the button goes down. But it looks as though your brain has begun to prepare the action long, long, long before that, at the time that the readiness potential begins. So the paradox, or the sort of problem, if you like, is that there's this very long gap. In brain time, 1 second is an eternity, during which it would seem, at face value, that your brain has decided that you're going to press the button because it's begun the preparatory increase in activity associated with the readiness potential, and you don't yet even know that you're going to press the button at all. So there's an unconscious cause of this voluntary activity. Well, this is quite paradoxical because it feels like I decide when to press the button. So you might expect that you have conscious thought first and brain activity second. In fact, you have brain activity first and conscious intention second. So that's the thing which attracted attention and which is all over the Sunday magazines and is, a sort of topic of interest. And it is rather difficult, I think, to square with your everyday life, but we leave our philosophy when we leave our armchair. The way we experience our actions is not the same as the way they actually work. So the Cartesian view of our action, which I think is deeply, deeply embedded in our culture, this is the way that I choose restaurants, and this is the way that I decide what I'm going to do with my life, or that's how it feels, is I feel that I have conscious intentions which somehow produce brain activity and which cause body movement. That's what it feels like to me, but it can't be right because it's just too dualist. It involves some kind of exceptionalism, some sense in which conscious volition can not be brain activity, but cause brain activity, massive mind-body problem, ghost in the machine. It's too dualist. We can't have that. Now, in recent years, the dominant sort of interpretation of the Libet experiment and of the whole field of conscious volition has really changed. And I'm going to try and present to you, I think, what many people believe, particularly in the US. This is the dominant view in the US. And I think it comes, it's inspired by some of the thoughts of Daniel Dennett and Daniel Wegner. And I've given it a rather strong name, perhaps a little bit too strong. But this view effectively suggests that we have unconscious brain activity which causes our body movements. But we know about our body movements from sensory feedback. So we notice that our arm has gone up in the air, to use the Wittgenstein example. And according to this theory, we use this sensory feedback to post-dict or retrospectively reconstruct an explanation for why our arm is in the air. So the way that this works is that I notice my arm is in the air. I think, oh, goodness. Oh, Patrick, don't worry. You meant to do that. It's okay. Don't be scared, right? So we retrospectively insert conscious intentions back into our stream of consciousness as inferred, not perceived, putative causes of what we're doing. Right. Now, this does occur. There's no doubt that Dennett is right, that we are continually constructing this stream of consciousness, and a lot of it is reconstructed retrospectively. I agree. The question is whether that's all that occurs. So a dominant view, particularly in psychology, and particularly in the sort of post-behaviorist tradition of psychology in the United States, is that's all you need to say about volition. There is nothing more than post hoc reconstruction. And I think that's too strong. I think there might be something a little bit more than post hoc reconstruction. And I want to try and talk through some of the evidence. And the strongest evidence, I think, comes from very rare cases where clinicians can directly stimulate the human brain. They can directly take control of neurons in the human brain. And Itzhak Fried, working in UCLA and Tel Aviv, in his operations as a neurosurgeon on patients with intractable epilepsy, will first perform exploratory stimulation of the brain in order to make sure he doesn't cut out the wrong bit, and he does cut out the right bit, very important. So he implants grids of electrodes onto the cortical surface. So this is the left hemisphere, and it's what you would see if you sort of cut down here and pulled off the right hemisphere, because you're looking at the medial wall. So the primary motor cortex would be somewhere here, and here's the inside, if you like, of the frontal lobes in the lateral fissure. And when he can perform these stimulations under computer control using wires which are externalized through a little hole in the patient's skull. And the patient is completely awake. They're just sitting still, and they're asked to report what they do or what they feel or anything that occurs when they're stimulated by the neurosurgeon. And Fried noticed that when he stimulated, in some cases, through electrodes around here, which are roughly in this medial part of area 6, which I mentioned earlier, the supplementary motor area, the patient will spontaneously say things like, I have an urge to move my right arm. Notice this word urge, which has got into the literature on volition, and we can't get it out. It's a very funny word. I haven't had this experience myself. I don't know the phenomenology. I'm very lucky that I haven't had to have an operation for intractable epilepsy. It's a really interesting methodological problem to know what is the phenomenology that these people have, but the word that we have in the published papers is urge. In English, it's a very funny word. It's got lots of Freudian overtones, which I don't think are intended at all in these neurosurgeon-evoked urges to move the right arm, but let's just use the word that's in the paper. So the critical point is the patient is given by the electrical stimulation an anticipatory experience which sounds like volition. I have an urge to move my right arm. It's certainly not free will, because it's not the patient who has the urge. The urge is given by the neurosurgeon to the patient using artificial stimulation, but it is conscious, because it does produce this conscious experience, and the patient has not moved at all. They're not moving, they're completely still, but they're being given an urge. So since they're not moving, it's very unclear how they could confabulate that urge retrospectively and reinsert it backwards, post hoc, into their stream of consciousness. Seems to me it's much easier to explain these data if you say that there's some kind of conscious readout of activity of neurons in the supplementary motor area, which gives us the experience of conscious intention. Now, interestingly, when Fried turned up the stimulating current to higher levels, then you actually got a movement, and it was the same movement that the person previously reported having an urge to make. So what that seems to suggest is whatever is producing this sensation of volition, it's on the main causal route, which makes us actually move. It's not completely independent of movement. So I think what that suggests is we can talk about conscious intentions as bona fide mental states. Dualism's incorrect, but strong confabulation is incorrect also. Now, just a little bit of local interest. There's a very hot technical debate about the fact that you don't just get urges here, you also get them in other parts of the brain. So here's some work from the Lyon group showing that you can get similar results in the parietal cortex. Right, so we've ruled out confabulationism, and we're sort of left with the idea that, well, there probably are conscious intentions, and I think if you're a neuroscientist, you have to believe that they're a consequence rather than a cause of brain activity. Loads of questions unanswered. You'll notice that there's no arrow going out of this box. We've got no idea why we're conscious of volition. I want to believe it's got something to do with learning, but I'm not going to present you any evidence about that today. What I am going to do is to consider a little bit about what kind of brain activity gives us this experience of conscious intention? And I'm going to do that using mental chronometry again. So one sort of view is shown in this model by Mark Hallett, that you just have a direct readout of something like a readiness potential. So here's a schematic readiness potential rising up to the moment of movement genesis. This is Libet's W time, and Hallett proposes that there are threshold levels of readiness potential at which you might become aware that you're about to act if you're asked, and then at which you become meta-aware that you're really going to act even if you're not asked. So this is a fairly sort of classic view. And it seems to me quite intuitive. It seems to me to fit very well with the general project of neuroscience that our conscious experiences are caused automatically by processes of which we're not aware. So this is rather nicely put by Michotte, who was another grandfather of experimental psychology. Very few people know that Michotte worked on volition. Everybody thinks that Michotte worked on causation, and he did, but long before he worked on causation, he did some seminal studies on volition, which, as far as I know, have never been referenced. But he said, le cours de certains processus volontaires se faisait d'une manière automatique. And you've sort of got to believe that if you believe in mechanistic neuroscience, that our experience of voluntary action is generated by unconscious events in the brain. Now, you can see several interesting things about Michotte's approach to mental chronometry. Look at the enormous apparatus that was involved in producing laboratory estimates of the time of subjective experience. We've moved on from that. Look at the cigarette in the mouth. We've moved on from that as well, certainly in the lab. Now, let's just talk a little bit about some of the philosophical concerns with mental chronometry. Well, almost all the philosophical discussion of the Libet experiment has really focused on a single aspect of the mental chronometry, which is temporal precedence. Brain first, then mind. That was the Libet order, and many people want to defend a concept of conscious free will, which requires something like mind and then brain. So people have focused a lot on temporal precedence. But there's something I'd like to just bring to your attention, which is that in psychology, you would never use mental chronometry to make absolute arguments about the perceived time of any single event, because people are very bad at judging absolute time. People are good at judging relative time. It's much safer, if you're going to use mental chronometry, it's much safer to use an argument based on the comparison of two percepts rather than saying such and such a percept comes 200 milliseconds before movement, because there are big errors in absolute timing. The really important point about mental chronometry is that subjective timing is not really interesting in itself. It's just a clue about the content of experience. So if there's any psychologists in the room and anybody's looking for a PhD project, a really good question to ask in psychology is when. It's always a really good question because it might tell you quite a lot about what. And I thought I'd just tell you about one of the experiments that I did right back at the start of my work on the Libet, or on volition, in the Libet tradition, where we were able to use when to try to say something about what. It's an experiment which is old, but I think it's still good. It's been debated in the literature since, but I like it because it was the first such experiment that I did, and I still think it says something quite methodologically interesting. Here is the readiness potential, which we've discussed before, and here's the average time at which people report an awareness of the experience of action. But as you get closer and closer towards action, you begin to see something called a lateralized readiness potential. And the lateralized readiness potential refers to the fact that around half a second or so before you actually get a movement, you begin to see a much greater activity in the cerebral hemisphere contralateral to the hand that actually moves. So if I move my right hand, that would be in my left hemisphere. If I move my left hand, it would be in my right hemisphere, relative to the ipsilateral hemisphere, the hemisphere on the side that actually moves. So the gap, the difference in the brain activity that you see in the contralateral hemisphere, which is driving the movement, and the ipsilateral hemisphere, which is not, begins to develop and gets progressively larger as you get closer and closer to the time of movement. Now, the important thing here is that this lateralized readiness potential is telling us quite a lot about process, because when the lateralized readiness potential begins, at the time that you begin to see this divergence between contralateral and ipsilateral, the brain, or the person, must have decided whether they're going to do this or this, right? Because you're beginning to see a shift of brain activity towards the cortex, which is actually going to do the job. So we've got two concepts now of the preparation for action, when the readiness potential begins and when the lateralized readiness potential begins. So we did an experiment which I can assure you was really twice as exciting as the original Libet experiments. These experiments, they're about interesting things, but they're dead boring to do because you're just pressing a button all the time. We made it really interesting by giving you a free choice about whether to press a button with your left hand or another button with your right hand. So it's really twice as exciting. Free selection between those two actions. And here, what I've done is I've shown the distribution of the times of awareness of conscious intention, of the Libet judgments, across each person's data set. Because people don't always say something like 206 milliseconds before movement. Sometimes it's often a second before movement. Sometimes it's even only a few milliseconds before they move, or even after. There's a big distribution. And we can use that distribution because we can use J.S. Mill's method of concomitant variation, and we can say, well, let's look separately at those trials where the person has a very early experience of the conscious intention to move, in red, and those trials where they have a very late experience of the conscious intention to move, in blue. And if this lateralized readiness potential is really the driver, the cause of my conscious experience of intending to move, by Mill's method of concomitant variation, early causes ought to produce early effects, and late causes ought to produce late effects. So therefore, we ought to find that the lateralized readiness potential for early awareness trials should be earlier, shifted left, relative to the lateralized readiness potential for late awareness trials. Now, here's the LRP, and the lateralized readiness potential is shown so that a positive LRP means activity in the ipsilateral cortex, which is not actually the cortex which is doing the job of moving the hand that you happen to have decided to move. And what you're looking for is a deflection into the contralateral zone. And what that means is that the hemisphere which is actually making you move your hand is more active than the one that isn't, right? So that's the specific form of preparation. And it's an extremely noisy potential because it's based on subtracting two noisy signals, but around a second to half a second before the actual onset of movement at time zero, you begin to see this contralateral shift. And during this critical period here, you can see that the red line leads the blue line. The trials with early awareness of intention have an earlier LRP than the trials with late awareness of intention. Now, I like that because I thought that might be giving us a clue that this moment at which the brain decides exactly which button to press, exactly how to execute the goal of pressing a button, either this way or this way, that might be what we're really aware of. So this might be an example of asking a when question to get a what answer. What are you actually talking about when you report your conscious intention? Well, maybe what you're talking about is not the earliest preparation that you decided to press a button, which you might even have decided when the experimenter sat you down in front of the buttons and told you that you had to spend an hour doing this experiment. Maybe what you're really reporting is the moment of the specific intention, the moment where the action becomes, if you like, real. Okay, so that's a little bit about readiness potentials. And in the last few years, there's been a complete upheaval, I think it would be fair to say, in the whole concept of looking for the neural basis of conscious intention. From this paper by Aaron Sugar, Stan DeHaan and colleagues, published in PNAS a few years ago, which really is a quite radical critique, even dismissal, of the readiness potential as an idea. And the insight of this work is that maybe part of the generation of our actions is not due to some anticipatory causal signal like a readiness potential. Maybe our actions are a bit random. Maybe stochastic noise in our brain is part of the reason why we act. So the thought here goes that we act when the activity in our brain reaches some threshold level of activity, which is shown by this dashed line here. And when we do something like a Libet experiment, the context, the idea that we eventually have to press the button, if only to make the experimenter happy, results in brain activity kind of shifting up generally closer to threshold. But after we approach that threshold, the specific time at which we act depends on a random walk, just a random process of fluctuating stochastic brain activity at some unidentified point, presumably in our cortex or possibly subcortically. So we have a process in the brain which is randomly oscillating, and it will eventually randomly walk until it hits this motor threshold, and that will constitute a trigger event, which will lead ultimately, potentially, to pressing the button. But the key point is that what makes you press the button is in part random. And the insight in this paper, which I think is really interesting, it's a possibility, it's not proven, but it's a very, very interesting possibility, is that what actually causes our action is this random walk of brain activity towards the trigger line. And that if you then average all of the brain activity that preceded all of these trigger crossing action events, you're basically looking backwards from each of these arrows, which are when each individual different trial, shown here in a different color of gray, happened to randomly walk up to the trigger line. And if you look back, you're always going to see that you approach the trigger line coming in an upward direction. Slightly different speeds with slightly different oscillations. And if you average all of them, you're going to get something which looks remarkably like a readiness potential. So the point here is that the readiness potential has been misinterpreted as being a cause and a signal and a driver in the brain and some part of mechanistic volition, whereas in fact it might be nothing of the kind. It might just be a complete artifact of selectively looking backwards at a random process which happened to take you towards the trigger level. It doesn't reflect any internal decision to act. It just reflects the random process that gets you into the action that you make. Now, those of you who are very observant will notice that this slide is completely incomprehensible. The reason, or the labeling is completely incomprehensible, the data is not. The reason it's completely incomprehensible is because I actually inverted the image in order to make negative appear upwards. Because, as I said, in EEG, we tend to plot negative upwards, and in the original paper, the readiness potential had been plotted negative downwards. So for those of you who feel that you can't read this, don't worry, it's just a flip of an image showing a classic readiness potential, which is not really readiness at all. It's just averaging noise. That's the assertion of this theory. Now, it's interesting that this particular paper leaves it open whether there might be another decision. So there's a hint in this paper that the real decision doesn't come at the point where where the brain initiates the readiness potential. Maybe the real decision is a late decision, that you reach the trigger point and then you say, Patrick, do you really want to press that button? And maybe there's some potential for a veto mechanism. It's not discussed in the paper, but many people have proposed that we may not have free will, but we might have free won't. That appears to be what Libet himself sort of backed himself into a corner of saying at the end of his career. And effectively, one can distinguish then between two broad classes of volitional mechanism. And I think this is a really important, perhaps intellectual tool for understanding how we want to think about volition. On the one hand, we can have early decision models, which imply that there's some sort of brain process which says, okay, now I'm going to make an internally generated action, and then the early go decision is followed by a systematic fixed neural preparation and build-up, which takes you to the trigger level and produces an action. So at this point, volition is really a bona fide brain process. It's something that one could measure and study, and one could let into one's cognitive ontology as being a real process and not some transcendental thing that one should dismiss. The RP signal is the cause of the action, or some RP-like signal, could be an LRP, is the cause of the action. And the alternative model, which has often been around in the literature, and I think it's fair to say is implicit in the Scherger work and in Libet's work as well, is that there's no decision here at all. This is just the brain getting on with its job, and we're only looking at the average of lots and lots of noise, which builds us up to the trigger level, and that's when the real decision happens. The real decision happens when you're about to act, and you say, do I really want to go? And in this case, you say, yes, go. Those are the only trials we ever see, because in the trials where you say, no, don't go, the person doesn't press the button, so we can't look at the EEG, because we don't have the lock point to view it. And critically, the assertion here is that this is not a signal. It looks like a signal, but it's not. So what I want to do in the last experiment that I want to talk about, and I think what will be about the last 10 to 15 minutes of the talk, is to talk about the concept of a putative internal volitional signal. I've been thinking a lot about volition in terms of trying to ask whether there is a signal in the brain that corresponds to internally generated action. If we can find such a signal, we're in a different place in terms of the methods of our discipline and conceptually from if we dismiss such signals altogether. So how can we search for an internal volitional signal? Well, I think the first thing that we want to do is we want to think, what kind of signal are we going to be interested in? Let's see if we can produce an experiment where if we do find a signal, we're actually going to care about it. You've heard of the expression, the varieties of free will worth wanting. And it's a good expression because it summarizes the point that most of the experiments that we do on volition are really bad, my own included. They're really weak. They're very, very poor. And they don't seem to capture in the lab anything of what we care about and what we are interested in when we ask whether we ourselves have voluntary actions or not. And the real problem here is the instructions. Almost all experiments on voluntary action involve some very weak and lame sort of instruction, like press the button when you feel the urge, press the button when you want to. And in a way, in most of the experiments in this field, there's a feeling that what we're really studying is not volition, but how the participant understands the form of instructions that the experimenter has given them. So we're not really studying the process, we're just studying the poor tools of our own experiments, and that's a bit depressing. Maybe we should do something else. That's not a nice thing to think. And in particular, the instructions seem to be loaded in their terminology. They seem to give the impression that free will or volition or voluntary action is a movement which is exceptional. It's caused by nothing. It's coming from nowhere. It isn't caused by everything. It's not actually part of our cognitive life. So we wanted to get away from that. That's the weakest point as a psychologist in all of the field of volition that I'm aware of, including my own research. And it really misses the important point, which has been well understood in philosophy, that, why is there a philosophy of action? What do people talk about in philosophy of action? Well, they tend to talk about reasons. And they insist that we make actions for reasons. And that, in a sense, that reason might be the cause, or might be associated with the cause of the action. And that's what we want to understand. That's where will or volition or all of these important features of human cognition might actually lie. And this insight I associate with Elizabeth Anscombe, but I think it's also been discussed by many others as well. So the concept here is that we need to have some way to get reasons into the lab, but the reason has got to be more than just a stimulus. There are lots of bad experiments that you can do on voluntary action, which are full of reasons. If I hold up a 50-euro note and a 10-euro note and say, it's completely up to you which of these actions you make to grab the 50-euro note or to grab the 10-euro note, then you could say that was an internally generated action because I haven't told you which one to choose, but there's a stimulus. And because of what those stimuli mean, you're likely to make a very stimulus-driven action. So we need a reason that's more than a stimulus so that we can talk about internally generated rather than externally triggered. So I want to tell you very briefly about some experiments that we've been doing just now, really, in London, collaborating with Aaron Scherger and my PhD student, Nima Kalaginajad, and we've embedded volition in a very well-studied task developed by Mike Shadlin for perceptual decision-making. And he works with monkeys, so that's the reason why this is a monkey. We've been working with humans. The way the perceptual decision-making task works is deceptively simple, but in fact it's been intellectually very, very productive. It's a very interesting body of work. The monkey is simply asked to fixate a screen on which there are lots of dots moving randomly. And after a while, these dots begin to move coherently, so that instead of just looking like white noise, they begin to clearly drift either towards the right, in which case the monkey's job is to shift its gaze and fixate the target on the right, or they begin to move to the left, in which case the monkey moves to the left. And this is a task which has been well used to work out how does the monkey use the visual information that it gets from the screen and then translate the visual information into the motor response that it makes with its eyes. We're doing a human task, which is a little bit similar. We're going to be having people make a left manual button press if they see the dots going to the left, and a right manual button press if they see the dots going to the right. But otherwise, it's almost exactly the same as the Shadlin monkey work, with one exception. It's much more boring, because we've inserted a very long and very unpredictable wait before the dots start to move at all. So you're sitting there thinking, come on, move will you, and the dots are just randomly oscillating. There's no visible movement at all. And you've got two choices. You can either just wait and wait and wait and wait until this coherent motion appears, and then if the motion of the dots moves to the left, as here, you press the left key and you get a reward. In our case, it's money. In the Shadlin experiments, it's juice. Or what you could do is you could say, no, this is too long. And you could use what is called in the psychology literature the skip response, or sometimes called the pass key. The pass key. And this is deceptively simple, but I think it's potentially extremely rich and extremely interesting. In our experiment, the skip response is in fact to press both the right and left response keys simultaneously. And what it does is it terminates the long and unpredictable wait for the dots to start to move, and it gets you to escape from the current trial and to skip to the next trial. But you only get a very, very small reward. You don't get much money. You get a bit of money, but nowhere near as much money as you would have got if you had been patient and done your marshmallow test and waited for the dots to move. So what this means is that the participant is able to make an action here which produces a lesser reward and is embedded in their whole reward-seeking behavior. But the critical point is that this action is not triggered by a stimulus. It's triggered by the internal assessment that I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to go on to the next trial. So that's quite interesting, because we've got what we would call an operational definition. My job really is doing experiments. If I do anything good, it's probably an experiment. That's all I really know how to do. And people sort of wonder, why do we spend so much time agonizing about experiments? And I think that really experimental design in psychology is exactly the equivalent of conceptual analysis in philosophy. It's just about trying to generate the conditions which allow you to operationally define your concept. And in this experiment, we've got an operational definition of a volitional action within the context of pressing both keys to skip to the next trial in perceptual decision-making, which has some of the important qualities that we want when we think about voluntary action. It's not a response to an external triggering stimulus. It's reasons responsive, because it depends on the task landscape of the rewards that you get by waiting versus skipping. For those of you who work on decision-making, it's a bit like foraging. It's a bit like thinking, oh, I'll try something new, which animals do all the time. In the foraging literature, it's clearly the case that you press when you feel like it, but critically, we haven't had to say to the subject, press when you feel like it. There's no explicit instruction about volition, and there's actually no subjective experience in this experiment at all. The subject never tells us anything about their voluntary experience of voluntary action. They just make the voluntary action. Okay, so we always need a control condition in any experiment. This is the volitional skip response that I told you about earlier. And the control condition, which is a separate block of trials, is that you're sitting waiting for the dots to move, and sometimes the fixation point changes color and goes gradually from black to red. And as soon as you see it going red in this block, your instruction is that you should press both keys to skip to the next trial. So we've got a block of instructed actions which act as a control condition for volitional actions. A classic Passingham-style contrast between volitional and instructed action. Now, we're going to measure the EEG, and we're going to look at the readiness potential during this task. And we're really interested in whether this readiness potential counts as a signal or not. Now, for those of you who are technically minded, we've done something which I think is technically extremely important here. When you do a readiness potential, you have to baseline correct the EEG, because EEG is very, very noisy. All the trials are all a little bit different. You can see that. Here's about 60 or 70 trials overlaid here. They're all a bit different, so we baseline correct them. And normally what people do is they make a completely arbitrary assumption about when volition starts, like 2 seconds before the movement, and they say, I'm going to take my baseline 2 seconds before the movement. I've never seen any argument about how and why we should choose the baseline. So we decided to make no assumptions at all about the readiness potential onset time and to baseline correct at the time of the action itself. So that's the reason why these tracers never get above 0, and there is a potential which is negative going, but it starts positive and gets to 0. Right? So this is a classic readiness potential which is just shifted downs, right? But take it from me. The really important point is that the only thing that we can objectively measure in this experiment is the action, and we've chosen that as our baseline. We've made no assumptions about when anything starts. And what you can see is that in the self-initiated skip responses, we get this gradual movement towards negativity, which is a classic readiness potential. And in the block of trials where the skip response is triggered by the fixation point, we get essentially a flat line. Right, so that's the readiness potential. And what I now want to introduce you to is the information that's present in the distribution. So here is the average of all of the individual trials, which are shown here. It's really, really difficult to see anything on an individual trial. That's why we average. It's very, very common in science that you average noisy data to get better data. That's completely standard. That's what they do at CERN with the Large Hadron Collider as well. So we've got individual trials, and what you can see is that these individual trials begin very, very scattered, and that they converge as you get closer and closer to the time of movement. And there are two reasons why that's happening. One reason we're not interested in at all, because it's completely artifactual. And that is that we have baseline corrected all the data to have a value 0 at the time of action. We've made that true. So the data must converge towards 0 at the time of action. We're not interested in that. What we are interested in is whether there's actually any convergent neurocognitive process. Before you press the button in the self-initiated trials, is the brain settling into doing any one specific thing that we can call volition or not? So we need to have some way of modeling this convergence and getting rid of the artifact. So here's the standard deviation across lots of individual trials, and you can see the convergence as a drop in standard deviation, which becomes sort of dramatic as you approach the baseline. But what you can see is that the convergence into a more stereotyped EEG pattern is more marked in the red line, which is the self-initiated skip responses, than in the blue line, which is the externally triggered skip responses. It's not much more marked, but it is more marked, and it's significantly more marked. So there does seem to be a kind of convergence, which is not just an artifact of baseline correction, not just an artifact of how we measure the EEG, which perhaps in this case even over a second before you actually move, seems to be regularizing the brain and homing in on one particular neurocognitive process which we can measure with the EEG. So what we want to conclude from this kind of recording is maybe that is a putative internal volitional signal. Can we model it? Can we say anything about what this signal is? So the original Scherger model is a model in which you have a step, which is that the task begins, and then you have this stochastic random noise. I'm sorry, this is extremely badly drawn, but assume that this is a white noise. And this noise is effectively randomly walking on each individual trial and takes you up from this step towards the threshold. So what you're actually measuring in the readiness potential is the sum of this and an integration of noise. So we fitted that model to our data, and then we compared it to another model where we have exactly the same context, noise, plus another term. And the other term, you'll notice, looks suspiciously like a readiness potential. It's a ramp. It begins as soon as the trial starts, but it's a fixed component, which gradually moves you towards the trigger. And from that, we can also sum that extra component in and get the measured EEG. So these are the standard deviations that we've got. And the critical thing that we've done in the modeling is we've fitted the data to the mean readiness potentials, but then tested what would the standard deviation across trials look like. We've fitted to the mean, but tested on the standard deviation. So we've actually fitted the models to this kind of data and then looked at what kind of standard deviations the model predict. So here's the standard deviation in microvolts. Here's time going up only to the time of action, because we're only interested in the precursor causes of action. The data is shown here in blue. So this blue line should correspond, sorry, this is bad. The blue line here should correspond to the self-initiated red line here. Sorry about that. And we fitted two models. In green, we fitted a model which is just based on accumulation of noise. And in red, we fitted a model which also includes this ramp. Last slide coming up. And what we can see is that model 2, which includes this putative volitional signal, provides a slightly, significantly, but slightly better fit than just noise. So the interim discussion of that experiment is that, yes, there's definitely neural noise, it's paramount importance, but there may be internal volitional signals as well. If you believe in early decision theory, or if you believe, I guess, in volition as a cognitive process, you might think that was good news. I think we need to do a lot more work to make a definitive response. And the next question is, if there is such a thing as volition, which we can find the neurocognitive signal of, what sort of factors affect this convergence prior to volitional action? So just to give some very general conclusions for the whole lecture, and then I'll take some questions, of course. The most important thing I want to say is that you can talk about volition. In the history of my discipline, from about 1918 onwards, nobody talked about volition. There was a behaviorist ideology which made it really impossible to talk about voluntary action at all. And I think you can talk about it, and I think you can talk about it in a way which doesn't make it exceptional, which makes it a cognitive process rather than something purely metaphysical. I think you can make it a bona fide neurocognitive process and an experience. The way that you do that, I think, relies crucially on an operational definition of what you mean by volition, which we implement in an experimental design in a laboratory experiment. I think it's very useful if, instead of saying, tell me what you think about volition explicitly, we can use an implicit measure like asking about when, or perhaps not even making any subjective phenomenological report at all. I think it's obvious that if there are internally generated actions, they must have precursors. Everybody believes that. They may be noise precursors or they may be signal precursors. The most important thing is that they're probably based on the kind of flexible integration of multiple cognitive processes that we associate with the frontal lobes in general. I haven't had time to talk about it today, but I think probably a really important concept is some kind of central command structure. And I think homeostatic control probably plays a much larger role in volition than anybody has talked about, but I haven't talked about it either. And here's the final point. I'm perhaps slightly unusual. Most people working on volition really show how little volition we have and that it's just an illusion, and they're really quite dismissive. And I don't think I'm quite as dismissive as them. I don't think we have free will in the sense that our culture and our everyday life makes us believe that we have it. Certainly not. But I think we do have an experience of volition. I think it might have an identifiable neurocognitive basis. I think we do know what we're doing. And I think at least sometimes we know what we're about to do. And I think that subjective experiences of volition are not only confabulations. Notice the word only. I don't deny that there's lots of confabulation, but I think there might be something which is not confabulatory as well, at least sometimes. And I think, most importantly, these experiences can be studied empirically. Now, on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd like to thank many, many people who've actually done all of the work. I haven't done much of it at all myself, but there are two people who've majorly contributed to what I talked about today, my PhD student Nima and my collaborator Aaron Schurger, and these people who paid for it. And I'm particularly grateful to the Institut des Études Avancées here in Paris, which has invited me to have a visiting fellowship for the month of May. And one bonus of that, which I hope is of benefit, is it's allowed me not just to come here and give a lecture, but also to run an advanced doctoral training seminar, which begins tomorrow, where I hope that with some of the advanced students here in Paris we'll have the chance to debate interactively at further detail what I think is a really fascinating and important topic. But really what I would like to say is thank you very much for your patience and attention. Thank you.